with climbing, it's just like so much is going on in your head that you can easily forget and neglect to engage those muscles. And you're essentially relying on your skeletal structure, right? The ligaments that are holding those bones together. And that's not, then naturally that's not meant to like be the securing system. It's the muscles that helps to create that forced closure of those joints.
All right, so we have a super special video this week. We're gonna do something a little bit different. So I loved doing the video with Dr. James Lee before, and we're doing another one today where we each independently came up with our top 3 reasons why you keep getting a finger injury. Now, we made these lists independently, and then we're just gonna kind of pull them out together and compare and talk about those reasons. The original inspiration behind this idea actually came from climbing. So Emil, myself, and our friend Matt Cromer were all climbing together, and he had been dealing with an injury, and then he kind of ended the trip with an injury. And Emil kind of just came up to me and said like, hey, we should do a video about why like certain people like seem to suffer hand injuries more often than others. Let us know what you guys think about it. Do you guys like this kind of format where we get this kind of Q&A and have this conversation? Or should I just read dead face from a teleprompter the whole time? I mean, your call, really. All right, so my number one reason why like people keep getting these hand injuries is quite simple, like overuse or too much training. What about you?
Yeah, I would actually agree. I would say they're pushing themselves too hard, too fast, and they're not giving like time to rest and not even climbing easier routes. People always want to try the hardest thing, so they're always pushing themselves, and they get injured all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I had on this like not having enough rest days. Like you hear those people climbing, 5 times a week, or they're climbing 4 times a week, plus they're doing like hangboarding on their quote unquote like off days. Like that's not an off day. That's not resting. And then like you said, like trying to do too much, like these 4-hour sessions where they have to be like wrecked or destroyed every time after, like is just far too much on the tissue and for it to like handle and adapt to.
And I would say, I think we all fall under that. Like I can't say that I'm not, innocent of doing that, right? We all want to try the newest routes in the gym, or if there's a project outside, we're just only thinking about that, and we're trying to train hard to the point where you're taxing your body to its limit. And I think it's not the best way of approaching either your projects or even climbing itself. At one point, your body's going to end up like saying this is enough, and something's gonna give, right?
Yeah, and you're right. Like that's a good point. I've been guilty of that myself as well, where I was tracking my training really well, and I was like really interested in how many different components like I could like train in and how to like best line it out. But by trying to integrate too many things, like I developed like an overuse injury. I mean, the benefit, I wrote stuff down so I knew what to like eliminate and what to keep. But yeah, like we're all like super stoked on the sport, so it's hard to not get an overuse injury sometimes.
Yeah, the most common thing I hear when a new person comes to see me is that there was this one route and they were trying it like multiple times over and over again. And that's like just a reoccurring theme is, if you have a hard route and there's a crux point at whatever part of that route, and if you're not able to like make it past that crux within 2 or 3 times, naturally, I would not continue to do that. But the common theme that I always hear is they've tried it like 10, 15 times, and it's that repetitive motion, that very specific like stress that is constantly stressing your body, whatever part of your body it is, finger, elbow, shoulder. But it's that very specific stress, and it's an intense stress to like at that, right? And so if they can learn to back off of those crux points, like repetitively attempting that crux, I would say that you can save yourself from a lot of injuries.
Yeah, so, and I think the important concept to remember with like overuse and why that's such a big component is because your tissue takes time to like adapt to these strains and stressors and to recover. And when you're doing too much, you know, you're really lowering the threshold of the tissue to be able to respond to those changes if you're not getting adequate rest and recovery time.
Yeah, I wonder, would you maybe be able to give like an example for your listeners? I think we can talk about these concepts, but maybe something more specific for people that they can relate to. So, what's like an overuse injury that you see pretty commonly?
Yes, I mean, I've seen people get a pulley injury from like overtraining, but then obviously the super common one people can relate to is that inside or outside like elbow pain or discomfort, like the climber's elbow or the like tennis elbow, because like they're just not getting that recovery. Plus, like your elbow, like those muscles you use, like people have jobs where they're typing or they're like lifting and carrying things, and they're climbing 4 to 5 times a week. So that overuse, yeah, we see that a lot with like the elbows, especially the medial and lateral component.
Yeah, I would even with the A2, like for example, specifically A2 pulley. Why is an overuse like constantly stressing that your fingers to that level? Why is it bad, right? And I think people have a hard time like when you're climbing and you're just starting off, you can get pretty strong fast, and or from like 2 to 3 months if you're consistently climbing, your muscles are going to get very strong quickly. But with connective tissue, right, your fingers have a lot of different collagen fiber connective tissue. You got the A2 pulleys, even your tendons, synovial joints, right? All of those are made up of collagen fiber, and there's not as much blood flow to those areas. So when they get stressed, it takes time for that recovery to happen. And unless you're allowing your fingers to rest, even a single day can help immensely to allow your fingers to recover, right? And if they're not allowing themselves to get that rest, then although the muscles, there's a lot of blood flow there, there's constantly nutrients are getting to your muscles, but the connective tissues, especially the A2, and I would even say A4 pulley these days, I've seen a lot of those type of injuries, and they're always pushing it too hard, too fast, and doesn't give any time to recover, right? I think I've said this before, where muscles, you can get strong within 2 to 3 months, but for the turnover rate for collagen fiber, it's 300 days, right? And so that means, not to say that your fingers are not strong to begin with, but if you're stressing your fingers and you need to give it time to like heal and like build more collagen fiber on top of it, it's going to take years for that to happen. And so you definitely don't want to always be pushing it too hard, right?
Yeah, I mean, those are some like awesome points for this. Like you mentioned, like, yeah, your muscles, they're gonna like heal, recover faster, but that connective tissue, you're right, it just doesn't have the blood flow to it. It doesn't have the nutrient supply. And that turnover rate, I think, is so important to understand, that it just takes so much longer. And that even kind of broaches on another point of like all the grade chasing, because people, you said you'll get stronger a little bit faster. And then people want to like chase these grades and they want to go harder and harder and harder. And they like don't accept the limitations of their body. And so they just keep pushing without resting, without being patient for these changes, and push their tissue to the limits and overuse it to the point where it breaks down and you get injured. Yeah. All right. So let's talk about like our number 2 reason why you keep hurting your fingers. James, you want to lead us off on this one?
Yes. So my number two, I would say, is rest is not the solution sometimes, right? And certain injuries, although you fully rested out, um, that may not always be the solution to actually recovering and getting it stronger. So I think with whether it's like inside elbow pain or even flexor, like finger flexor tendon pain, uh, and when people have the understanding that you just got to rest it out, and especially COVID, I think actually one thing that has really like just come to light in my practice, it was a little bit dead during the beginning of COVID season, and afterwards, once the gyms reopened up, people went back to climbing, and they realized, oh my gosh, like my injury, the issue that I've been having issues with. I thought resting it out for 4 to 6 months was gonna do the job, but it actually has come back to them, and they still have those same aches and pains with climbing. So rest is not always the solution for those type of injuries, and I think we can go into more detail about it. But what's your number two?
Okay, so my number two is the repeating the same move or like movement style like over and over and over. But before we get into mine, I want to focus on yours. It's like particularly a great transition because we are just talking about overuse injuries. So at first you're like, rest is not always a solution. You're like, what are we talking about? We're on like two different ends here. But I think what's important to kind of qualify with what you're saying is what I also see all the time. Like, and you're right, especially since COVID, when people had this opportunity to rest, a lot of times with these injuries, and we talk in like heavy detail about this in like our A2 pulley video of how you have to like reintegrate proper like tissue loading. Like when you have an injury, if you just rest on it and then don't do the appropriate amount of rehab for it, you're not triggering those changes. People think that if I just rest, the tissue is going to fully recover to where it was before. And not only with finger injuries, but with like, medial or lateral like epicondylitis or like that. Climbers or like tennis elbow, where people are like, wait, you want me to like exercise with this? You want me to do these things? You want me to load it in that position? It's like, yeah, you need to trigger those adaptations. So just doing like just purely resting isn't necessarily going to help you recover from that injury. Like I agree. That's a totally valid and great point.
Yeah, one example that comes to mind is when people stress their flexor. So like their flexor digitorum profundus, which allows you to like flex just your DIP joint or your distal interphalangeal joint. That muscle like travels all the way down and inserts onto. It actually doesn't insert into the medial epicondyle, but it inserts into like the ulnar bone and in between the ulnar and the radius. So when that specific finger flexor, let's say you're going for a pocket, like a two-finger pocket, and all of a sudden feel like a shooting pain down into your forearm, into that specific finger. If you rest that out, like you were saying, that tissue tolerance, to be able to load that tissue and allow your entire system to adapt and like feel comfortable enough to load it, starting at like five pounds, and then you progressively increase that load. Doesn't have to be like very regimented, like literally holding a 5 pound weight, or it can be as simple as still climb, but only grab onto jugs. And when you're grabbing jugs, you don't have to fully be grabbing like this. Like start to grab those big jugs just on your fingertips. And that allows that tissue tolerance to rebuild itself and to get your whole system from, we talked about like pain, right? Pain is very elusive. It's very like hard to grasp, but it's learning to get your brain to not freak out so much with even grabbing those lighter like resistance pulls, right? And if you just completely rest it out, you're not going to allow that system to like reset itself. It's going to actually become more hypersensitive to that specific load, because naturally your brain is thinking, this is dangerous. I actually should not be pulling this hard. But a lot of my patients, when I test out their finger strength, I'll actually see how strong they're able to pull on an individual finger here versus here. And then I just go down the line. And surprisingly, they're actually able to pull a lot harder than what they perceive is like how much they're pulling, right? And so if unless you train that and you're continuing to like slowly, progressively loading that tissue, you're not going to allow your system to reset itself and eventually pull a lot harder weights, right? Or minimal edge in the sense of climbing itself, right?
Yeah, so you're right. I've even seen that. So in the clinic, we use like a BTE to measure like strength production, and it does it to like 67.25 pounds of force or something. And I had this patient on there, and we're doing 3 isometric trials. And the first one they did, I won't know the numbers exactly off the top of my head, but say it was like at 60 pounds. And they said like, oh yeah, that kind of hurt a little bit. But we kept up with the trial because I knew the tissue was safe, it was healed, it was going to be okay. By the 3rd trial, they were at like 67 pounds and they didn't have pain. So like their body was protective and like it responded to that first load like, oh wait, is this good? Is this bad? But then by the 3rd one, their body was generating more force and it was totally fine because it picked up like, yeah, this is a safe activity to do. But if you don't ever load that tissue, you're right, those defense mechanisms just stay in that on position and don't allow you to generate that force you need to.
Yeah, and that's what ends up causing like chronic issues to happen, is that you don't allow that tissue to like progressively load itself, and you become very sensitive to those certain aches and pains. And what you think that it's going to get better after like a month or two, it ends up coming up to half a year, up to like several years. People will come to see me after like having an injury for 5 years, and I'm like, what's going on? It doesn't make any sense, right? But now that we understand more of the pain science behind everything, like it makes a lot of sense, and it's about restoring that system too. Okay, so just a recap. Rest is not always the solution to getting your injuries recovered, right? Sometimes you have to learn to progressively load that tissue, not only to get the neurological system for your brain to actually feel comfortable with that stress, and then slowly being able to load that. If you fully rest it and just get back to climbing, that's not going to allow that system to restore itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then just to be clear for you, those out there saying they don't need a rest for training, we're talking about resting with injuries, not just resting during the week with your training cycle. Okay, so and then my number 2 was about repeating the same move like over and over. And so like specifically what I see a lot with this, and it's so hard to not fall prey to it ourselves, is you feel like you're getting like closer and closer and closer on a move, and you just keep doing the same move over and over, and it's just so much stress that you're applying to that tissue in the same exact manner. And you'll see people have like done it 10, 12, 15 times, and then eventually something gives. Either hopefully, they just get a little bit weaker and so they stop trying it, or unfortunately, a lot of times what happens is they end up hurting themselves. So I kind of have a rule of thumb on that of, 7 tries. I might go to my project and the first 2 or 3 are kind of more the warm up. And then if I'm not going on that 7th try, I'm usually going to get tired. I'm usually setting myself up for an issue or an injury. So I go into it saying 7 is my limit. If I don't do it in 7, I'm done. And I have to hold myself accountable for that.
Yeah. That I totally agree, because I actually, so you're 7, sometimes I'll actually tell my patients to, like, if it doesn't go within 3 to 5 tries, but I think, relatively speaking, those numbers from 3 to 7, it doesn't make that big of a difference. It's knowing when to stop, right? And I think a lot of times people they don't learn to stop. And for me, it's like if I don't go within 2 or 3 tries at that specific crux point, I'm like, I'm done. I don't really. I used to like try to push myself pretty hard, but I've come to the point where it's like there's a certain move, and if I can't get past that, or even make a little progress past it, then I'll just give up or come back to it at another day, right?
That's another great point. Because I do have different sets for that as well. Like if I'm outdoors bouldering on a project, like my limit is 7. If I'm moonboarding and I'm doing a bunch of different things on the moonboard, my limit is 3. If it's not going in 3, I'm moving on to another problem on the moonboard, and that's been and will be my policy. Whereas like if I'm doing something that's like, more horizontal, like in the cave and I'm on kind of jugs and it's just a body tension thing, I might give it a couple more like attempts. So what you said is a really good way to kind of define it, is just people not knowing how to set limits. So you should go into something with kind of knowing your own body, knowing how many attempts you should try to it, and not just like continually overdoing it like for an hour at a time,
Yeah. And actually, you bring up a really good point about like what body part is getting stressed with that particular climb, right? And for sure, a moonboard, maybe for some people that are unfamiliar with the moonboard, why is it that you only limit yourself to 3 tries on moonboard?
Yeah, that's a good point. So because the moonboard is not only so dynamic, but also at that angle and mostly on smaller holds, especially those dynamic movements, it's putting a lot of strain and stress on my fingers. Like I should be generating good tension with my feet and keeping the core good, but it's so hard not to cut and have your feet blow off the moonboard, placing all that load on your fingers, that I know like I'm not going to repeat that more than 3 times, because I don't want to put all that load on my fingers and suffer an injury that way. Just in summary on that one, it's going to depend on the style and what you're doing, but know yourself, know your body, and try and set limits so that way you don't just repeat the same exact move over and over again and set yourself up for failure. Even if you're stoked on it, set a limit. Okay, my third reason is about not training for the moves that you expect to be able to do.
My third reason is just lack of body tension.
So why don't you talk about the tension component and how that's going to set you up for that finger injury?
Sure. Whether it's because certain muscles are weak, or it's just also not being aware of learning to keep your body having that body tension. So, for example, a lot of times when like people are grabbing slopers, right, big sloper movements like this, and when it actually doesn't even have to be slopers, like someone will say that they come up with like a cramp, and as they're pulling up, all of a sudden they hear a little pop in the wrist. Or another example is like you're doing this like crimpy Gaston movement, and then you're trying to like lock off, trying to progress to that next hold, but all of a sudden they feel like this big pop or tear in the inside of their elbow. Like maybe they actually partially tore their medial collateral like ligament on the inside of their elbow. And it makes a lot of sense why you end up stressing those particular body parts, is because we're so focused on like keeping that tension in your fingers. Maybe I'll talk a little bit on anatomy. Let's go back to the anatomy a little bit. So when you're grabbing on your fingertips, as opposed to like even doing a half crimp, this is using the profundus muscle, as opposed to when you're doing a half crimp, you're using the superficialis. that superficialis actually inserts onto the inside of that elbow. But let's say someone's doing an open cramp Gaston movement, and when that muscle that only is connected here and it's just short of that medial epicondyle, and they're not focusing on like keeping their wrist tension muscles, which also helps to protect their elbow. You can easily focus so much on your fingers that you're forgetting about your wrist, or you're forgetting about the elbow, and that can put a lot of stress on those guys. Another, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say like that. I use another example for that with like your shoulders. People get so focused on like their hands and not properly engaging like their mid back and like getting the scapula retracted. It ends up putting a lot of strain and stress on the shoulder, which then, I see almost more shoulder injuries in my practice than I do hand injuries. And some of that's just due to like inadequate like cross training and whatnot. But yeah, a lot of it is they don't have any awareness of creating tension in their back and keeping that stable. So like what you're talking about, not maintaining that tension like throughout the like upper extremity, and then placing all that strain and stress on one part, I can definitely see how that is going to add to that injury risk.
Yeah, like one of my patients, she was just doing like this traverse movement here. So from here, she was going over to like the next move, and it was a pretty wide, dynamic movement. And as she was going for that next hold laterally, her shoulder pops out and she dislocates it, right? And why does that happen? You could argue maybe she was really hypermobile or she's double jointed. But if you're consciously aware of like keeping that tension in your body, especially in that shoulder, right? Scapular muscles, but even deeper inside, like those rotator cuff muscles, if you're not learning and you're not really understanding how to keep that tension there, then this can easily become like very susceptible for that shoulder joint. It becomes scary, but at the same time, if you can learn to like keep that body tension in place and then go for that movement, that really will help to protect your shoulder, elbow, and a lot of the wrist issues too that I see. It's just due to a lack of that tension. So wrist flexion, you have those two wrist flexors here that primarily connect to the medial epicondyle, and that crosses the elbow joint. But you can also think of keeping that tension in the elbow by flexing your biceps and triceps, because those muscles also cross the elbow joint, obviously, and that helps to really keep that elbow secure. But with climbing, it's just like so much is going on in your head that you can easily forget and neglect to engage those muscles. And you're essentially relying on your skeletal structure, right? The ligaments that are holding those bones together. And that's not, then naturally that's not meant to like be the securing system. It's the muscles that helps to create that forced closure of those joints and helps to protect you. So body tension is huge.
Yeah. Not only that, but they've done this in like studies and research, and they give people different cues and they test like their finger and grip strength. And they've shown that like if they cue them to keep their shoulder and their core engaged and their bicep engaged, that it actually produces a stronger contraction of the fingers. Part of that is exactly what you're saying, just the stability of the joints. You're then able to produce more force. And the other component of it simply relates to the neurological component. Like if you're engaging more muscle groups, you're increasing the neural activity, which is then giving you better feedback for the force that your body can produce. So yeah, producing, like you said, producing that good tension improves like strength of the surrounding joints, improves stability, and will definitely keep you safer.
So in summary, I would say the lack of body tension is what one reason why people tend to get re-injured is that, not to be too focused on just your fingers, but while your fingers are grabbing onto the wall or the rock, that you want to really learn to keep the tension in the wrist. And the wrist, in order to keep that tight, you got to get all the muscles surrounding your forearms engaged. And those muscles also cross the elbow joint. And then you got your bicep, triceps, like keeping that tension as you're able to climb. That'll significantly help to reduce injuries in the future.
Perfect. And so like part of what we talked about in that last one helps segue into our last topic, which was my number 3 of not training for the moves you expect to be able to do. The classic example is like never full crimping, then deciding you need to full crimp to send your project. Like to me, that's a huge mistake, because really you're saying like, I'm never going to use this tool until I absolutely need to. And a lot of that comes from like bad education and like fear avoidance of like, well, my buddy Jack told me never to full crimp, but I kind of like it, so I only do it when I really need to. And the reality is, if you're not at least somewhat practicing for these moves, or even take pockets, for example, like I see people get injured on pockets all the time. And even like quite literally today, like Emil and I were we're taking a trip out with the group to like Joe's Valley, coming up here. And he's like, hey, like if you haven't integrated pocket training into your like routine, you may need to, because there's more pockets out there. Innately, he knows like you need to have this in your repertoire. You can't just go like climb on a bunch of pockets, or you're going to get hurt. And that's the reality. Is you go do a style, or even with you're talking about like the shoulder, those movements, if you've never practiced those movements and then expect your body to be able to do it, you're setting yourself up for an injury. Now, that doesn't mean you have to like do all of your training on like full crimping or all of it on pockets, but you need to practice what you expect your body to be able to do.
Yeah. So, for example, how would you practice improving your pocket game, like for climbing? What would you do?
So for me personally, like I take my hangboard routine, and during kind of like the first warm up I integrate, just sometimes some like unweighted hangs where I'm just getting my shoulders warmed up, and I'll do it like 4 fingers, then 3, then 2. And then even when I go to my sub max, right before I do my max hang protocol, I will add weight and work on like an open hand position where I drop to 3 fingers and then I drop to 2 fingers and work on my pockets. But I also integrate that with, my quote unquote like farmer crimps, where I'm adding weight inverted, so the weight's on the ground and I'm using just a Metolius rock ring, and I'll do it just on my index finger, just on the ring finger, just on the ring finger. I show my middle. But I do it on each individual finger, and I just safely load that finger with that weight, so it has some of that training. It has some of that force adaptation. And then like same thing like with the like full crimping. I don't do like a max hang protocol with full crimps, but I do recruitment pulls with full crimps every single week. That way I'm not overloading the tissue. I'm just loading it to what it wants to handle.
I like that. I like your third point because it also ties back to what I was saying, like keeping lacking that body tension. So, um, when people are so focused on like doing some crimp movements, and like they have to specifically learn to lock off and progress themselves, like unless they're concentrating, unless you actually practice those movements, like you were saying, how about your pockets? But with those movements like that, if you're not consistently learning to engage your wrist flexors to help protect your whole system here, like that's gonna have potential risk of injury, right? So learning to practice that with certain movements. And some people actually, when in the middle of the climb, unless they're able to do like a bouldering route from the beginning to the finish, like they won't try the parts of the climb itself. And um, I think you just have to learn that, sure, you could do the beginning part, but unless you practice like that middle portion and actually get to that middle portion and like learn the movements, you're not going to be able to make the send properly or in a safe manner, I would say, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it can be related to so many different types of your climbing, and it really is like if you want to be able to control that big move or that swing, you have to be able to like practice it. If you want to be able to like span that move, you need to practice it. And that's one of those like training techniques that coaches will employ is like repeat the same problem until it becomes easy. So then you're practicing a technique, trying to dial it in and how to make it easier. A lot of people, they send their V6 and then they're like, I don't want to try it again because what if I can't do it again? It's like, no, you should try it again and maybe you'll get better at it. And you should, I know, right? Like that's so common. People just don't want to try again because they're afraid of failing. Was it just a one-hit wonder? But like if you don't dial that in, you don't practice that, then you're not ever really like improving your technique. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess in summary of that, really, it's don't avoid something and then expect to be able just to pull it out. Climbing involves a lot of different technique, whether it's a style of climbing or it's pockets or like crimping. Don't keep something hidden in your toolbox and then just pull it out last minute thinking it's going to work for you. Practice it and then employ it when it's appropriate.
Right. I just to add a little bit to that, I think we see amazing climbs on YouTube where someone's sending like a 515B or right, and it's just mind-boggling how much how incredible it is to see that climb, but you don't see the hours and hours of video before that climb, right? And so it's we're so focused on this like social media age where we get the perfect sends, but learning to practice the movements before you get that perfect send is really important. I think it needs to be said because people only see the finished work, but there's a lot of work that comes before that, right?
Yeah, got to practice the moves you expect to be able to do. What was the video called with Adam Andre where he does like the 15C?
Silence.
What?
Silence. Was that?
Yeah. So do you remember watching that where he has his trainer, like he's laying on the ground and his trainer is replicating the moves so he knows the body tension? Like, okay, yeah, I've never done that. I don't have a trainer to do that, but you're absolutely right. It's like, that's next level. It's like a rest day for him. So he doesn't want to put all that strain and stress on his like fingers and joints, but his rest is building the tension in those weird moves and having his like trainer just resist at the joints. So he knows that tension and has every move dialed in. Yeah. Practice the moves you want to do.
Just a little plug in my practice. I'm giving a workshop. I'm not sure when this video is going to be coming out, but I'm giving a workshop on climbing injury prevention and learning how to rehab through your climbing injuries. It's geared towards healthcare workers, physical therapists, occupational therapists, and it's also accredited through the IPTA for 8 credit hours. So that's coming up November 7th. You guys can feel free to sign up on my website. I think maybe in your show notes, Jason, you would have some info for a couple links for that.
Yeah, please, check out James's Instagram. He's got some great stuff there, especially like if you're in that Chicago area. He's got his own private business out there, so he can help you like rehab and recover from these injuries. And if you can, check out that workshop as well to learn more about climbing injuries and rehabilitation. Until next time, train, climb, have a conversation about how to prevent climbing injuries, apply those interventions to yourself, send, repeat.
Simple. Who doesn't do that, really?
Everyone does it.
Who doesn't apply interventions?
But for the few people who don't,
Yeah, true.
they could benefit from knowing. Yeah. The little guys. just gonna kind of pull them out together and compare and talk about those reasons. So we'll just get right into it. Emil's laughing, I knew it was bad.
No.
What, Emil?
You just said we're gonna pull them out together and compare.
Like, yeah, same. Emil's just so mature.
It's not my fault, you're the one that said it. Oh, hey, you're still here. Jason, they're still watching.
Oh, heyo.
Dude, say something cool so they like the videos and subscribe for more awesome content.
Like and subscribe for more super sweet vids, y'all.
So lame, dude. So lame.
I thought it was pretty good.